Everybody, good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm Applerouth. I'm here with my friend and colleague, John Cadenhead.
What's up? I dropped my microphone. Sorry, everyone.
Dropping the mic at the end, not the beginning.
I know, I failed. Sorry.
No, that's really good. So tonight, we're excited. We're talking about the final of our three-part series, How to Show What You Know. It's going to be helpful. We've covered the beginnings of how learning works. That was our first introduction to this process. The second one was preparing, getting ready, studying. And then finally, it's how to demonstrate mastery, show up on test day, how to do some final prep, and then go in there and knock it out. And so we're going to have an hour. We have Q&A at the end. We always will share with you like the copy of our slides. And we'll also share with you a link to watch the video later, or share with spouses, friends, children, and so forth. Yeah, we're happy to be here.
Yeah. So we'll give it one more minute because people are still popping in. Then we'll go in and have a lot of fun. All right, while people are popping in, I'll go ahead and do my little spiel. One of the things about learning about how you think and finding better ways to process and learn information is thinking about how do I retain information longer. And one of the things that we've encouraged throughout this series is going and practicing taking notes, whether you be the parent or you're the student, whoever's listening right now. It's helpful in order to retain things in a more effective way, because you can hear us talking, which is great. We have a PowerPoint up, which is going to be great. You're going to see things. But that retention comes from mixing your visual, your auditory, and your kinesthetic processing. And the kinesthetic processing is a fun word that everyone forgets what that means. But what it means is taking that pen to paper and putting down your thoughts. And so what I'm going to encourage you guys to do is grab a piece of paper, a pencil, something like that, and jot some notes down. And what I don't want you to do is try to write down everything we say, because Jed and I have a few good things to say, but you don't need to know exactly our words for things. What you need to know is the idea behind our words. And so paraphrasing and putting in your own thoughts means that you're going to retain it longer and have a lot more fun with it. So think about that, try it out, see how it goes. There's no wrong answer to this. All right, and so let's talk about our goals for today. We have 4 main goals. 1, understand why assessment matters in this day and age, because it does. But it is, as we were dealing with COVID, as we've moved virtual, as we're going back in person, as we're dealing with how to process and retain information in these different ways, we want to make sure that we understand why this matters and how it's important still. Then we want to talk about how to prepare for tests, how to prepare for other assessments like pop quizzes or papers or stuff like that. We're going to build out some key strategies for that. And then we're going to look at strategies for actually when you're sitting down for a test day of, what can you do to be successful? All right, so Jed, I'm going to hand it over to you for the first part.
And we'll take a moment while we have everyone here to do a 1-question poll. Go ahead and tee that up for us. All it is getting a sense of who you are. If you are a parent, a student, or a teacher. And also, if you are a parent of a student in high school, which class? Are they seniors? Are they juniors, sophomores, freshmen, or other? All right, so just click one of those things, and if they apply, and then X out, and we're good to go. All right. So assessments, tests, they matter. They factor into our assessment, our grades, how we're doing, but they also do a lot more than that. There's a real power to assessments, and John and I are both very firm believers in the importance of value of assessing, of measurement, essentially. Measurement informs everything. It informs progress. It gives critical feedback. That without it, you don't have a sense of what you don't yet know. And there are different stages of assessment of, formative at the very beginning, and interim assessment, and then you have summative at the end. And they all do different things, essentially. But one of the primary things, whenever you take a test, whenever you have to grapple with a question, a concept, an essay, it forces you to recall information from long-term memory. And the very act of having to go back through the neural traces and recall things forever changes and strengthens the neural connectivity. By having to ask yourself, do I know this? It makes it embed deeper into memory. Or it gives you feedback of, I don't know this. Let me go get information that would help me remember this. And it's really interesting. There's something, I was listening to a neuropsychologist talk about this. I'm sorry, a neuroscientist. And that he was talking about how our phones they all make us dumber. They have our pictures of my daughter is very, very pretty. But more than that, we'll have our kids on our phones. Is every time you reach to your phone to get a quick answer of, oh, what was that movie Scott Baio was in 1985? Bam, you pull it up and then there it is. Or what was that song? Because when you don't go through the process of scouring your internal memory banks and looking and tweaking and neurons trying to fire, then bam, oh, I remember now. When you don't do that, the memory trace actually keeps getting weaker. Every time we go instantly to our thing, because part of it, the act of struggling and finding reinforces the connection. That's really interesting. So again, when you have an assessment, when you have to do forced retrieval and recall, it strengthens memory. And so the idea is testing is useful as a measure of what do you know, what do you not know, how are you doing in terms of mastery of the concept vis-a-vis your peers, your teacher, how's the class doing? But more than that, assessments are a primary mechanism whereby your brain learns to hold things for longer. So testing is really, really valuable. And there's so much research. People have dedicated their entire academic lives to studying this and the effects of testing on memory and retention. So really a big lift there. All right, next up, we have, a few more things that when it comes to testing, it's not just waiting for the teacher to go and give you a formal assessment, that piece of paper for a grade or a quiz or a test, whatever it is. You can actually go and self-test. And that's something that's really, really important and really helpful. John and I both work with students almost every day. And I saw 3 yesterday. My big day was normally Tuesday, but it was Wednesday. And my students, whenever they're doing review, whenever they're trying to learn something for a test, and my kids all have tests every week, I've been pushing them so heavy to get away from any kind of passive review. Any kind of review where you're just reading over something, you're glossing over it, you're reading your notes again. That is essentially, it's not worth less. It's not worth nothing. But compared to forcing yourself to recall and retrieve information, it is such a weak way of learning by reviewing notes passively. So you have to have the chance to make mistakes. You have to have the chance that do I know this? I do know this. Versus let me just read some notes again. Then you aren't getting the feedback of what you know, and you aren't reinforcing the knowledge you have. So testing locks in information, it changes the brain, and it makes deeper encoding forever. So testing is huge. And so for our kids, it's, are you using Quizlet? Are you using, are you splitting your notes and going back and forth? Are you doing flashcards, making your own paper digital ones? Are you doing something which forces you to ask, do I know or not know this? And then if I don't know this, I change my approach. All right, thank you. Next slide. All right, so next slide. I think we're oh, there we go. All right, so in terms of preparation for tests, everyone, all of our kids, whatever grades they're in, if they're in 6th or 8th, 12th, or in college, they're going to have to memorize some things. We don't yet live in a totally open note world for all of our classes, and so definitely, and also part of it, you have to have a certain level of foundation of information and knowledge to be able to go and open notes. You have to have certain things you have and you can retrieve instantly, and so memorization is part of school. And critical thinking and problem solving is a bigger part, but definitely you're going to have to learn how to memorize certain key things. So there are different ways of learning and memorizing. John and I both have worked with students who have employed very different kind of strategies. And it's interesting, if you think about it for a moment, where you learn how to memorize things. If you actually can think back, like, because obviously you're watching this, you've memorized things over your life. And part of the question is, who taught you? Who showed you? How'd you figure it out? Was it a sibling? Was it a parent? Was it a teacher? Did someone pull you aside? Was there a class you took? Did you read a book on memorization? And a lot of kids just try to figure it out. And some of them, I've seen some of my students, and John is too, where they're figuring it out, but it's really inefficient. What they're doing, one of my students was just repeating things, like saying it again and again and again and again and again. It's called phonological repetition, and it's one of the absolute worst ways to memorize anything. Is saying the same thing, like, versus there are much deeper ways, more interesting ways, and this has all been deeply researched. And part of it is the deeper encoding strategies, the more complex, the more where it's deeper encoding. Because when you say the phrase or say the thing, you say it out loud, it's shallow. You're not really going to a deeper level of understanding or connecting. I'm just saying the thing and what it's tied to, and that's it. Versus, can I make connections? Can I work? Can I link things in memory? And one of my favorite things was, as a student, was always memorizing, like, using acrostics, using the first letter, linking things together so they were chained together in a series, or some kind of mnemonics or a sentence, things like that, versus just repeating it again and again and again. And one of the also, self-testing is also a way to, encode things first. Let me just say it 10 times. Let me say it once. Do I know it? Check myself. And so there's also really interesting visual strategies where students like link things with connections and arrows and, or numbers. Things are all linked together visually. I've seen students make concept maps, where you're interacting with, you're chewing on it, you're struggling with it. You aren't just repeating the same thing, 20 times, which is really very inefficient and effective. Next slide. There's a gentleman I mentioned in our last talk, if you were there for this. He's a giant, Herman Ebbinghaus. And Ebbinghaus was one of we laid the foundations for essentially all future memory research. He was just, back then, before you went to grad school, someone would sit in their garage and they tinker with things, they figure things out. And this guy decided to test his memory using nonsense syllables. And he wrote down hundreds of nonsense syllables like ka and la and ra. And he was curious of how, if I memorize a sequence of nonsense syllables, how long do things last? How much will I remember in a day, in a week, in 3 months, in a year? This chain of nonsense. And so he would do this and he would test. He was using himself, but his findings are pretty durable. And his brain was pretty similar to our brains. And what he found, that it's not, what's most important is not the amount of time you put in. What's really important is putting it away, going back and revisiting it, and then putting it away, going back. And every time you come back to it, the brain responds differently. That if I just keep forging ahead every time, like the synapses, when they're firing, I can fire for half an hour or an hour or 2 hours. But then when I walk away, okay, that was something we did for a little bit. Now it's not meaningful. When I come back to it, I'm telling the brain, this is still really important. It's like, oh, this is still really, really important. So these synapses, these connections, let's actually increase the strength. Let's, increase, in terms of the number of receptors. Let's make this connection more easily available to us. So it'll potentiate faster next time we need it. And then if I come back to it a third time, the brain's like, oh, wow, this really must be important. And so I'm going to hold this, the synapse gets really anchored in and it holds it for much, much longer. So the curve, you can see here the graph. And also, if you want to retain it longer, you begin to add distance between those retention moments. So I'll wait 1 day, 3 days, 5 days, and the brain's like, holy cow, we're not going to forget this. So that's just something for learning how the brain works. And often students don't know this. And students, they might cram the night before. But if you really want to retain something, so one of the key things is people who have a hard time with retention of memory, the day after you see something in class, go back and just reinforce it, review it, notate again, and then come back to it in a couple days. And so that'll really, really improve retention long-term for the majority of our students. Next slide. And, part of it, there's also a whole body of research on interference, on cognitive interference, that when I spend 3-4 hours on one subject, the material it starts compounding and it starts squeezing out earlier material and middle. And ultimately the brain is really good at remembering things at the very beginning of a session and the very end. Think about movies or think about other things or songs. Like we often lose some of the middle, or books we loved, but often endings we stick with us and beginnings. It's primacy and recency, and there's evidence for this. Daniel Kahneman and Tversky did some research on even like surgeries that if no matter whatever the pain score was in the middle, if it ended and it was easier at the end, you remember it as being easier than if it was like a score of 2 or 3, then you go to an 8 at the end, you remember the 8. And so part of it is our memory, like whatever happens at the beginnings and ends really matter for our brains and how we understand experiences. And so, bad first impression and a bad ending, that can wipe out a great middle. But in terms of memory and encoding, what the key is, the longer you go on a single subject, the more interference builds up and the more you forget. So spending 3 hours learning history is way less effective than if I spend 3 single-hour sessions doing history, broken up by other things, by breaks, or on different days. And so that's really important for studying, because often kids, and I was guilty of this myself, doing marathon sessions. And after grad school, I stopped doing that. I began to really break things up more and really add in breaks. And I realized the time away. And there's also a thing of the importance of forgetting and relearning. And that's actually really meaningful, really important versus just kind of pack it in. And so being mindful of changing topics is really helpful, and also giving yourself good breaks. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to testing and assessing, I mentioned like Quizlet, because all of my kids now are using Quizlet because they're ready-made. If someone's doing a certain book or Hamlet, or there's a certain chemistry thing or certain calculus, someone out there in the world has generated a Quizlet, which is these digital flashcards tagged for, the Japanese character. If any book someone's using, there's someone else who went through it, and it's shared. The shared brain is pretty amazing. So instead, versus you having to spend an hour or two, and I have kids who go through and they pull up 5 or 6 different Quizlets on the chapter they're on, and that's how they review. And I am so much a fan of that, because again, it's all forced retrieval. I see a concept, do I know it or not? And the other forms of testing, you go and teach someone else. So one of your students may go and teach me this. And whenever there's ample evidence, like my colleague Sherry Oberens did all this research on peer tutoring, that was her PhD thesis. And what she found, that peer tutoring primarily helps the more advanced peer. Because when they're teaching, they're reinforcing and coding, seeing what they learn, and cementing what they learn. So by the act of teaching another, you're also reinforcing and learning yourself. Flashcards, divided notes, I did that in high school, where you have the concept on one side and the other thing on the right, and you cover one, you cover the other, make sure you go back and forth, testing yourself. And then there's self-explanation, where you walk yourself through. For my graduate school, my thesis defense, I would go through my questions and I would actually record them. And I'd play it through and walk through the entire 5 pages, and I would make sure I had it all before I go into my comps, my comprehensive exams. All right, next thing. So other things you can do in terms of rehearsing, you're making concept maps, you're drawing things, connecting this goes to here. This is really important, star, you're outlining information. So, but let me not just read the chapter passively. If I read it again, let me outline, make key concepts, write things that are important or meaningful, write out pros and cons, answer questions at the end, looking for themes. So you're interacting, you're engaging, you're generating. And that's really an important component. If you're not generating, it's really not as helpful. And anything passive is really not effective. And you'd be amazed how many kids come to us and they're doing passive review. And that's all they do. And they're doing a lot of it. And they're saying, I'm spending so much time studying and learning. And it's like, you're using the least effective methods known to man, but no one ever taught you this stuff. This is ed psychology and research-based stuff, which often the teachers themselves don't know this stuff. They may know their content area, they may know calculus, but in terms of the pedagogical, the scientific strategies of how to, of memory and coding, they learn calculus, they didn't learn this stuff too. So part of it is helping kids just get better strategies. It's key thing. Next concept. And I mentioned before this, for the research, that it's better to break things up. And there's ample evidence research. Rodiger, a few other people were doing this research. And that when you're immediately after like a 3-hour block of, I do algebra for 3 hours, bio 3 hours, immediately after, I'm going to have a better sense of that material. So I just spent 3 hours doing it. So it's in there for the moment. My brain is primed, things are up. So I can take it right then. I'm doing pretty good. But if I wait a week, the students who mix things up, who had 3 separate sessions for the same amount of content time, do dramatically better. So the walking away and coming back 3 times has a dramatic effect on long-term encoding retention. This to me is enough to change how I study. This and the research has been replicated and it holds. This is a strong effect. This has testing effect, and spacing things out. So tell your kids, and for yourself, if you want to learn something, memorize something, a speech, lines, walk away from it and come back to it. Don't just keep going for a big marathon. All right, next. All right, and then one kicker, motivation. This is all, a pretty big deal for motivation. One of the things is motivation is also like tied to skills. And then students who feel, like if motivation is often low, if you feel like if you apply energy, it's not going to be effective, and you don't have the skills you need, that can affect levels of motivation. That self-efficacy, like believing that you're going to do well, affects motivation. And so it's giving students, the skills they need, but also, motivation, it helps if a student is going for a specific goal that they've chosen themselves. That can be more motivating than someone else externally giving them a goal, or a parent or a teacher, whatever it is, that they declare it. And part of it is knowing expressly, if I'm going on this assessment, I'm going for an 85. There are 20 questions. I can only miss 2 or 3 questions. That can be helpful for calibrating how I'm doing in performance as you're going forward. All right, next slide, please. And then, when it comes to tests and assessments, it's very helpful that students understand historically how they do and actually study past behaviors. So they're not blindsided. They know typically on my practice tests, I'm doing this, but on the official tests, I do this or this, and getting a sense of how to help you calibrate, are you where you need to be? And especially when it comes to like exams. Even if going to the exam, I have an 83, and our goal is keep that B, but historically, I've ended up scoring like 20 points below my average. That has to help us inform how we study. So it helps you calibrate, just knowing that typically when it comes to testing, have I done well? Do I tend to show up and I'm strong on a game day, or historically do I have to buffer, add in more time, do more studying, and so forth, and just help engage levels of calibration of your confidence and your performance. So your past is really important to understand and think about and reflect upon as you're getting ready for your tests. All right, next question. And procrastination. It's something that every one of us on this webinar deals with in some form. Some of us are black belts in this, and we all have ways, and certain topics might do it to us. It could be some students, they procrastinate because of perfectionism. That's simply a different style. They're worried about not doing it perfectly, and therefore they don't. Some of them, they're spinning on the introduction and then they just jump to the middle. And part of it, I think there is something beneficial about having self-consequencing, that ultimately giving yourself, using your own reward system, not externally motivated, but if I finish this first page, then I get this thing that I want. And don't always give yourself, give the candy to yourself. If you want to go on Snapchat, talk to your friends, or you want to go and play a game or Fortnite, whatever it is, learning how to use self-consequencing. That, okay, first, let me eat the frog. Let me do the hard thing. And then after I've done part of this thing, I'll have earned this. And then that's helpful. And also just knowing your time sucks, knowing I have a few things on my computer set up where if I start going down the rabbit hole of Reuters or CNN or other news sites, it says, shouldn't you be working? And it's like this focused app I have. And after 15 minutes, it stops me and says, get back to work, which is actually really helpful for me. And a lot of my students also lock down a lot of their other, their group chats, other things, which can be so distracting, things that can ping you. So part of it is managing your environment to minimize distractions. Part of it self-consequencing, and part of it understanding what's driving your delay. And that's important too. All right, John, up to you.
All right. Yeah. So let's talk about specific test day strategies and what's going on in that world. One of the things to be thinking about is what actually do you want? What actually does the teacher want from the test when you're prepping for a test, right? So we can think about, well, different strategies for studying, but different strategies are going to be useful for the different types of tests. I had a teacher when I was in grad school that I took a class with some undergrad, and I was getting A's on all the tests and the undergrads were not. And so they came up to me after one of the tests and they said, "Hey, John, how are you studying for this? How are you doing so well?" And I told them a secret. And the secret was the professor writes 3 words on the board every day. And those 3 words will show up on the test. And so when he writes a word on the board, write that word down and figure out what it means and make sure you really get it down. And that's really obvious in hindsight, but in the seeing of it, because he wasn't on the board very much, because it was just mostly a verbal teacher, like it wasn't cluing into the students, like that's what we need. And so looking towards what the teachers are actually doing and how they're spending their time and what they're putting their energy towards really helps for the test. So like if the teachers are giving you regular practice for homework, make sure that you're comfortable with that. I have a student I was talking with today. He's like, well, I just don't like doing the homework, but I'm not doing well on the tests. And so there's helping him see the correlation between if we can practice the homework represents what the test is going to look like. So getting accustomed to that. And then I think it's very important to recognize that you shouldn't try to conquer this mountain without actually asking for help. And the first and best place to ask for help is the teacher itself, themselves. So going up to them and asking, I want to be successful here. I know I didn't do as well as I wanted on that last test. I wanted to see if you could give me some advice on how I could study better. I've never met a teacher, myself included, who wouldn't help a kid who asked me that. I definitely give them recommendations on what they can be doing, either walk them through the more normative things like how's the homework going, how much energy are you putting towards it, are you studying it again before the test, those sort of conversations. But I also probably suggest coming and having a study hall or something like that. When teachers offer study halls, take advantage of those things. Other things to do is talk to other classmates who are doing well, like those undergrads did with me, or talking to upperclassmen, like who has already taken this class? How did you study for this class? Especially if you already know that upperclassman from sports or something like that. It's a great opportunity to take that. The next piece is understanding the layout of the test, because tests are different, and knowing what this test is going to look like will help you prepare and study in a different way. The hardest test I ever had in my academic career so far is a test where I had 2 grades for the whole semester. It was in grad school, and one was a paper, and I got a B on it, and I'm ashamed to say it. Sorry, everybody. I got a B on that paper, and then I had a final. And so I went up to the professor before the final, a couple weeks before, and I said, hey, how is this final going to be set up? Is it going to be multiple choice, short answers? What's the layout going to be so I can make sure I prepare correctly? And he looked at me and he said, you'll find out when you get there. And that was the meanest thing anyone's ever said to me, because I don't know how to study for something if I don't know what it's going to look like. Am I going to have to write? Am I going to have to circle multiple choice questions? Am I going to have a conversation with a professor? Because that's an option too. I'm going to study differently for those things. But the good news is that most likely you will be able to figure out what that test is going to look like. And most professors are a lot nicer than that, most teachers, because they will give you advice on here's the layout. It's going to be 30 multiple choice questions and 2 short essays, or whatever the case may be. So knowing how to study for a multiple choice versus an essay and whatnot, we'll be talking about that in a minute. Yeah, so like we said before, what's the format of the question? How many questions are we going to have? How long do I have for this is also a very important thought process. Do I get the whole class period? Do I only get some of the class period? If there's multiple sections, can I flip back and forth between them? Because that'll help me prepare. Should I write the essays first, or should I do the multiple choice first? Or do I get the option at all? I've definitely had some teachers in the past say you have to finish multiple choice, and everyone's going to be on this multiple choice for 30 minutes, and then I'll pass around the essay. And then the teachers who give you the whole thing and let you choose your order, because there's different strategies for studying for those things. If you know that the essays are harder to write, then giving yourself more time for those essays if it's open for that. And then what's the scoring system? Is there partial credit? Do I have to write out all my work for the math problems, or is it just circling the right answer at the end so the teacher can see it? And then how important is this for my overall grade? Is this 10% of my grade? Is this 3% of my grade? Is this 30% of my grade? How is this going to matter towards how I end up at the end of the day? Will really affect how much energy I put towards studying for it. And then also knowing what's allowed for the test, right? Can I use the calculator? Is this open boat? Oh, open boat. Is this open notes? There we go. Can I have one sheet? I remember some professors were always you could write it on one flashcard, anything you put on that flashcard. And I'd watch people type it on a computer, shrink it down to the smallest font possible, and then glue it on that flashcard. And that's crazy because then you need a magnifying glass to handle that. But what do we need to do in order to bring in the right stuff with you? Because open book tests always I watch students be super excited. They're oh, it's open book, so I don't need to study for it. And that's the most dangerous thing that I've ever heard, because in reality, open book tests are harder than closed book tests, because open book tests expect you to be able to recall a whole lot more detail than a closed book test does. And so what we need to do is build out a system, plan ahead. I think is my next slide. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Prepare your notes ahead of time, simplify what you need, categorize them down so that you can reference them when you need them, but you're not going to them for every question. You want to have built out your best study a couple of pages for your open notes so that you already know it all. Like the process of studying for an open note test should prepare you for the test, so you don't need the open notes, because you're paring down, you're paraphrasing, you're owning the sentences that you're looking at and processing them to a higher level, sort of like what Jed was talking about a few minutes ago. There's also time management during the test, so planning ahead, right? So if they've told us how long we have for the test, making sure that we're using that time correctly, because man, it's awful when you feel that little stick figure up there. Oh shoot, I'm running out of time. I am freaking out with where I should be. Right. So like, for example, how long does it take you to write 3 paragraphs on average? Do you know that? That's probably something that we should all figure out. Like, it's different per person, but it's an important skill to have, of like, if I've got 5 minutes left, can I really write 3 paragraphs? Do I have that skill? Probably not. It usually takes more than that. But multiple choice questions. Most multiple choice questions are designed to be finished within 30 seconds to a minute. So if you've got 30 multiple choice questions, be aware you're probably going to need like 15 to 30 minutes to do them. Another thing that I think is very important is your sleep cycle and what you're eating before tests. What you put in your body helps you perform. And so proteins and carbs are things that will make your body run longer, just like if you're going to do a big sports meet, getting proteins and carbs in your body will keep you going. If you've got to sit down for a big test, proteins and carbs can help you out a whole lot there too, because man, it's a lot harder to take a test. And I've never met anyone who can do as well when they're super hungry on a test than they can if they've got food in their belly. And then also sleep. So like Monday night sleep affects Wednesday's morning, which is a crazy thing to think about, but your body is reacting to what happened 36 hours previously. So you're always playing catch up from your sleep cycle earlier. So if you're thinking right now of like, man, I am tired right now, it's probably from what, Tuesday's sleep? Yeah, that's what's getting to you. All right, Jed, back over to you, sir.
Thank you, John. All right. So when it comes to performance on tests, the ability to regulate one's attention is obviously a major factor. And the ability to regulate one's emotions is also a meaningful component. The ability to inhibit distraction. It's like there's how much you know, and then there's how much you're able to access under this stress condition where you have to perform in that moment. And John and I have both seen students who knew a lot. They had done the work, the preparation, the material was in there, but under a stress condition, they couldn't access all the information that they had encoded before that. So things were short-circuited. And it's really frustrating when you put in all this time and energy and effort and you go to that, when it finally counts and matters and you have, a real stress response, and then you can't, because part of it, when there's too much stress hormone in the body, too much cortisol, it starts to inhibit working memory. You can't access things like, and whenever we're really scared, if some of us have had really negative experiences, you can't access all your memories in that moment. It's kind of how the brain works, how it prioritizes things in terms of when there's a real threat that's perceived. Some of the memory systems aren't very effective in that moment. It's more about fight or flight. It's more about survival. It's more about, in this moment, that's not important right now. And so it's all about the present, and your eyes change, your breathing changes, your heart, all these things change. And it's, it's less about pulling things back from, what I studied last week. So when it comes to performance, we all need a certain amount of stress, a certain amount of arousal, a certain amount of stress hormone. And there's an old document, an old graphic here, the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It's like 1908, or it's very old. But looking at when it comes to other mammals and primates and humans, when you're in a stress condition, you need a certain degree of stress to perform at your best. And when there's no stress, that's not great, because our best work, and think about it in your life, the work you're most proud of, your biggest accomplishments. Was there some stress involved? And or was it just this joyous, fun, playful, expansive one? Typically, when we look back at our lives, the things that we're most proud of, there were we were working towards. There was constraints and deadlines and things, and it was challenging. Writing a book when it really mattered. There was definitely some stress, some arousal. So stress isn't a bad thing, but too much is a problem. So when there's not enough, you rarely achieve your peak performance or one that you're really, really proud of. When there's too much, we know students can have real negative experiences. The whole thing is hitting that sweet spot. And in helping students realize that some arousal is actually lovely. Some stress hormone is actually lovely. Some, even you call it anxiety. A little bit is your friend. But obviously a little bit can shift. So like so many things, it's the golden mean, the right amount of stress to help you perform at your best. Okay. When it comes to managing stress and arousal in the academic domain, an important thing to think about is having a strength-based approach when it comes to working with your students, your kids, is, okay, before I start, so you're having a challenge in this domain, you're having a lot of stress on these assessments, and it's impairing your performance, it's affecting it in a negative way. And the first question you ask is other strengths they have in their portfolio, their repertoire. Is there any other area of your life where you have to deliver and perform in a timely fashion that you're able to, manage stress levels? And for many people, it's on the athletic field before a big event or big match. For some people, it's performing arts. If they have to sing, they have to deliver lines. If they're a debater, they have to perform in that moment. And obviously, your performance matters. And so what do you do to help yourself center and ground? What have you learned? And can we bring some of that into this domain? And some students, athletes, it's interesting, like if you watch someone like Michael Phelps, back in when getting warmed up, before he had a certain playlist, certain things. He did certain things. In his mind, he was going over certain patterns. And so part of it is, can you bring some of that that energy to academics? And so our, athletes are going over things in their minds every turn, how they're going to feel. Can you actually do some rehearsal in your own mind of how you're going to be when you come to this assessment? Some people, play music for inspiration, motivation, other things. Some people, do a lot of self-care and take care of themselves. And they try to calm themselves, center themselves, do deep breathing. We've all had students who, they need to go for a run, and that helps them ground themselves. And there's ample evidence that, exercise is really, really good for lowering levels of anxiety. And that's one of the primary first things you go to if a student's having anxiety is, are you getting enough cardiovascular, exercise? And that really helps because it creates a cascade of good stuff: serotonin, dopamine, endorphin. It's really, really good for the, neurotransmitters, neurochemistry, and it's the body in general. So if you have any strengths in other domains, can we try them here before we go in and reinvent the wheel? Because you already have a sample size of one. If certain things that helped you, can we use those here? Next slide. Sean Baylock is a researcher for many years now. She's like the head of some university. But when she was in Chicago, she was doing research on the body and anxiety. And she found that one of the primary ways, a very simple little technique, is spend 10 minutes and write about the anxiety. Some people are afraid of even acknowledging it. Like, no, go towards it. Write about it, how it affects you physically, cognitively, what happens to you. And the very active writing about it helps you kind of get a hold of it, helps you wrangle it more, helps you know yourself a little better. It kind of pops the level of metacognition, of being aware of your thoughts, your thinking, and your inner states. It's like a mindfulness pivot there, kind of paying attention to what, versus just, I don't want to deal with this. I hate what happens to me. It's like kind of lean into it. And the outcomes are very positive. People who spend even 10 minutes show an increase on performance after they do that little 10 minutes of writing. Okay. And then there is a great thinker out of Michigan, Ethan Kross, who he's very helpful. I mean, the self-talk, we know self-talk matters tremendously for regulating inner states. And there's a foundational researcher in our space, Lev Vygotsky, talked a great deal about self-talk and educational learning. So much is what you're telling yourself. And your inner messages are really, really meaningful and really important. Albert Bandura was this giant out of Stanford. Ethan Kross is doing the research right now. He has a great little book called Chatter. And if you have time and if you have an issue with self-talk being negative and critical, pick this book up. I gave it to my mom, and I think it may have changed her life, which is interesting. People who have, some people, they're hounded by their negative self-talk and their inner critic. And for some kids, they have this inner voice which really doubts them and deflates them and says, here it comes, now it's over. Like you missed a question, now the end is near. And there are kids, this really is their self-talk. For other people, they miss a question, not a big deal. This question next, what's next? Some people, they miss a question and the panic and the fear begins. And like, oh God, now it's here, it starts again. So part of it, the inner voice, you actually have some agency here in terms of the voices in your head that you let dominate your inner landscape. This is a kind of the foundation of cognitive, behavioral therapy, is understanding your inner cognition. Your self-talk is a big deal. And so part of it is short-circuiting critical negative self-messages. And so we bring that from psychology and counseling into our tutoring and it's performance, and getting towards the inner coach that's nurturing, validating, reinforcing, positive, versus the critical, the one who's there to undercut and shoot you down and say, here, it's over, now it's going to go badly for you. And so having kids become really mindful of when they're in the good, internal, inner, positive, nurturing, coaching voice, and having them even imagine, who is that person? Is there a coach you identify with? Is there another person you admire, respect, versus this critical part? And whose voice is that? And having them learn how to get a sense of what's happening in their inner dynamic internally. All right, next slide. So Ethan Kross, one of his little bits, he has 21 strategies, I think, or if not even more, in his book called Chatter. And one of the ones which I love, which I use, is a little thing here of shifting your self-talk to you statements. Now, I do this myself. When I'm trying to calm myself down, I get myself like, Jed, you can do this. You've got this. Hang in there. I talk to myself from this external, this third person. I'm sorry, the first person. It's like, I don't say, I've got this. I can do this. I'm ready. I shift it to you. Like, you've got it. And so that's a little thing kids can try. And what it is that you're creating a little bit of psychological, like a little bit of distance, a little separation from the feelings you're in. And you're kind of going to a more grounded, centered, some people call it going to the balcony, going up a level, having some separation from the feelings. And that to me has been very powerful. And so I recommend that kind of, little simple technique there. Next slide, please. And additionally, I also do this. I find it very helpful when you have a very critical voice. And I learned this when I was reading Jung back, 25 years ago. Carl Jung talked about archetypes constantly. And that was his real passion towards the end of his life. And archetypes are these parts of your consciousness. And there's a lot of research on different parts of your personality. And there is a part of your personality that is going to be there that's tied to, criticism and tied to why'd you do that? And, if you trip, like, oh, you idiot, there are certain inner voices. And part of it's understanding what's that about and where did that come from? It's not all just your peers or parents or family of origin. Some of it, it's this part of you that's there, that's, and then part of it's, in my mind, tied to the amygdala, like the center for looking for threats. And if I don't want to embarrass myself. And so I'm going to be careful. And I think it's helpful when you have a very active, critical voice for whatever reason, whether it was someone in your family infused that, some of the generational stuff, your environment you're in, you have a very strong critic. There are times it's helpful, again, to make distance by giving that critic a name, giving it a face, giving it, and I joke about calling it Murray the Worry, something that would help you. Has to be personal. And if you can name it, you can tame it. That's also a counseling thing. By giving it a name, you start to actually get some hold of it versus just these voices coming and attacking me. It's like, no. I actually, I know who you are. I know what your job is. I know what you're doing here. And it's all inner dialogue. And it's like, your job is to say these things, thanks, but no thanks. And right now I'm going to go put you on this island and put you. And so it's like you begin to get a hold of yourself versus feeling like you have no control. And this is a strategy to get back some agency, some control over your thinking. So this is standard cognitive behavioral psychology stuff. But again, it's very helpful and helps kids with managing their arousal and anxiety for testing. All right, next slide. Breathing is incredibly important. Some of you out there do yoga. Some of you out there do other mindfulness or meditation. And when the breathing gets good and deep diaphragmatic breathing, it calms you down. And we know through the research and putting on, these electrodes in the brain and looking at breathing, what's going on. And part of it, you have this long wandering nerve, the vagus nerve, the wandering nerve, which goes from your brain all the way down through your heart, and then through, down into like diaphragm and below. And so when you're doing this deep diaphragmatic breathing, you're stimulating this vagus nerve in a certain pattern. And this kind of rhythmic pattern, this rhythm, actually it affects your parasympathetic nervous system, and it turns it on. And the parasympathetic, that system begins to bring down rate of respiration, your blood pressure, if there's, it starts lowering your cortisol level. It's physiological, it's biological. So this deep breathing really works, and it's one of the go-to strategies for kids, because your breathing when you're scared gets shallow, and it gets shallow, it gets more like, in your chest. It's not deep, slow diaphragm breathing. So if you learn how to do this, it does calm things down in your body. Very helpful. Next slide, please. All right. And then the last part is, the ability to inhibit distractions, because your attention matters and you're trying to regulate your attention. And for sure, there's going to be off-task thoughts, off-task things. And part of it, the challenge is, what do you attend to? What your attention and executive function, one of the key components, John and I teach these skills, is how to regulate your attention, how to keep your focus, learning techniques and tricks. And as you get older, you get better at regulating your attention. John has, I think, a 6-year-old. I have a 1.5-year-old, and they're ping ponging everywhere. Their attention that gets hijacked constantly. And as you get older, when you're 15, when you're 20, when you're 25, you are able to regulate your attention better in most cases. Kids with ADHD grapple more with this, and it may take them a few years longer than someone who's neurotypical. But part of it is learning how to focus, learning some tricks, again, paying attention to certain, like the body, getting back into your space versus what's happening outside. Someone's crumpling paper, someone's tapping something, someone's coughing, and that might really recruit your attention. Or just off topic thoughts. And I begin thinking about something else, or I begin thinking about the repercussions if I don't do well on this test, what might happen, and suddenly I'm off, and then my attention has been hijacked. And so part of it, there are times people imagine they're in a bubble, and you begin to imagine you're in this filter, and you intentionally begin to tune down those external stimuli. And this is definitely a skill. You learn how to do this. Mindfulness meditation, in the beginning, everything distracts you. Over time, when you get distracted, you come back much more quickly. So it might be before you meditate, it takes half a minute before you get yourself back centered. And a master meditator could come back after like 3 seconds. There's a big clap, a bam, but then they get back to their center. So you learn, it's a skill. We're building a skill, and your breathing is helpful. Some people, they're very tactile, having something to hold in their hand. Like I often, for over a decade, carry like stones in my pocket, and I'd be able to hold them, and a crystal, a rock, certain kyanite, certain things I like to hold, lapis, and I could, the pressure of it would help me center myself. And so again, there are many ways to do this, but learning, it's a skill which you get better at over time. Next slide, please. John.
All right, yeah. So we'll wrap it up with some key strategies for looking at different problem types now. So we're diving back into, as you're taking a test, what are different concepts you're going to be seeing? How are they going to be laid out? And how can we be successful in that way, in those ways? Let me click the right place for this. There we go. So the fill in the blank questions are our first type, right? You're going to see a sentence with a word or a phrase or a section missing, or maybe you're labeling parts or such like that. The key thing here is focusing on what the teacher is going to be caring about for this, right? And so that comes to a play where getting to know the teacher's expectations can help a whole lot. Because some teachers want to make sure you're getting the big idea of something, and some teachers want to hear exactly the word that they're expecting. And so making sure when you go in and you're taking fill in the blank tests, you know that you've got a fill in the blank test, that you have a better understanding of the teacher's expectation. So going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? Going and talking to the teacher about how can I best study for this? What are the key things that I should be caring about? But a lot of questions like this, you want to make sure that you're learning key terminology in those capacities. Short answer questions are another type, right? They're containing usually more than one part, a piece of something. So like a multi-part definition or list some examples. I've found that for short answer questions, most teachers will want you to write complete sentences. They'll tell you if they don't, right? But if you answer with phrases, sometimes you lose the main idea of a sentence by trying to like parse it down to something simple. and the grader doesn't follow your train of logic. Like I'm working with a student right now where that's his biggest struggle, is like he knows what he should say. He has the right answer in his head, but he's not providing all the context of the answer on the piece of paper. So the teacher isn't seeing that he knows the information. They're just seeing what he's giving them, which isn't all the information. So we're learning how to make sure that we're providing everything onto that paper. Right. And so the other thing that's important is stay on task and answer the question specifically, right? So if the question asks for 3 examples, don't give us a dozen, don't give us 2, and don't go with examples or topics that are off the goal of the question. There's short answer for a reason. Multiple choice questions, often the most common type of question that you see on the test, partly because they're easy to grade. So no offense to any teachers, I've been there too, I get it. The good news is that one of those answers is right. And sometimes when you read the question, you'll know exactly what the right answer is. It means you studied well. But the other thing you should be doing as you're looking at them is trying to figure out what are wrong answers. So narrowing down your options and focusing on what gets in the way of a good answer. Like as you're looking at this answer choice, what word wrecks the answer? Another way to do it that's really important is like creating your own answer. Figuring out what would you say if this was a fill in the blank test? Where would your brain go with it? And then what answers follow the same suit? Some teachers are a little meaner with multiple choice than others, right? They will put answers that are very close, but have some like bad words that don't work contextually to the story. And some will make it really easy. Like I remember I would put David Bowie in some answer choice at any point in time as my fill-in when I really just needed a 4th answer. David Bowie would make it into the, whatever unit of history we were studying at the time. So very obvious that was not the right answer. Sorry, David. Guessing and elimination strategies, right? Narrowing down your options by finding what we like to call, but you can call it whatever you want, this idea of a throwaway word, a word that gets in the way, like I was saying a minute ago, a word that kind of wrecks the sentence. The other thing that's important is that if you read an answer or a question or an answer, if you read both, and there's a word that you don't know or a term or a person or something like that, and you're like, I don't know what that word is. I don't remember what that is anymore. Don't automatically just toss that answer. Just because you don't know the word doesn't mean it's the right answer. Try to use this throwaway process to see if you can find answers that are wrong. And if you're stuck with the answer you don't know, then as long as you know the other ones are wrong, it's okay to choose that answer. I watch a lot of students just throw away anything where they haven't heard that term before. And it's a dangerous world to live in. In terms of math and science test strategies, I think that important to approach these, making sure that you have the necessary tools you need, right? It's very hard to take a math test where you're expected to have a calculator if you don't, but also making sure you know where you need to go. So often a math question is set up with like an equation, and then they're asking for like, what is X? So if our goal is to solve for X, then we need to simplify that equation down, whatever the process is, right? So if it's like a polynomial, like factoring it out or something like that. But if our process is what is X squared, then we have a different goal in mind. And I've watched a lot of students like do the right work, know how to do the right problem, but land on an answer that's not correct on a multiple choice test because they solve for X instead of X squared or some silly information like that. The other thing that's important on here is write everything down. When we're working in the math and science and the STEM fields like that, oftentimes there's a lot of steps to the process, especially in like physics class and stuff where you're going to do a lot of math and equations and working with like polynomials and whatnot. So in a comfortable world, we can keep those ideas in our head. But when we're stressed, when we're feeling anxious, like Jeb was talking about on the test, putting it on paper is going to keep us in a safer place because then we don't have to worry about it all falling out when there's a noise or anything like that. In terms of writing essays, making sure that you're putting time into brainstorming and organizing, figuring out where you're going to go, develop your ideas, and then figure out the order you want to hit them and how they build off of each other are always very important. I've worked with 5th graders who are learning how to do this, and I've worked with college students who are learning how to do this. But I always stress this is our first key thing: is like take a sheet of paper, scratch out your goals, scratch out what the main ideas we want to say are, and then figure out the order of events. In terms of writing it, for pretty much all papers, you're going to be looking at 3 main things, right? You've got an introduction, which tells us where we're going to go, and it's going to label out our ideas. We're going to have the main body paragraphs, however many there are. 3 is pretty common, where each paragraph has a specific goal. They're explaining something in key detail. And then there's the conclusion. And oftentimes students get a little nervous writing that conclusion. But the rule for writing a conclusion is a conclusion shows now can't you see my argument based on the paragraphs, right? So introduction is, here's where I'm going, and conclusion is, now can't you see it, where I went. But if you're writing an essay, especially bigger essays, especially if you're taking like AP classes and stuff like that, and the histories or the Englishes, where you have to write these guys out, having time to review is always super helpful. Look for spelling, look for punctuation, but also look for sentence flow. And did I get my point across fully, or am I missing some information to really say my idea? Most teachers don't care if you just put a little strike through of a sentence. They're not expecting you to go crazy like erasing and stuff like that. So saving time is always a nice thing there. All right, we're almost there. For long-term projects, I think it's important to think about the amount of things that you have to do. So I work with a lot of students on planning out long-term projects, and it's more than just like listing out each of the things you need to do, but it's also listing out when they need to be done by, right? Because if you have to write a 5-page paper and you're doing it the night before, you can list out each step, but that doesn't mean you're going to get it done in time. So figuring out how long does that normally take for me, giving myself a little extra time for breathing, and then giving myself due dates for those things that are on different days. Like when we built out this PowerPoint presentation, right? We planned out things ahead of time. We didn't make this up today. So adding dates in our calendar, blocking out specific times to work on them. And then similar for writing papers, set dates for an outline, set dates for a first draft, set dates for a time for someone to check it and read it over, right? And so planning ahead and asking your teacher, would you be up for reading my draft? And then having a draft with enough time where they can read it and give it back to you, right? Because if it's the day before and you're asking them to read a draft, they're probably not as interested as if it was the week before. In presentations, like planning them out, just like we talked about, practicing them out, just like we're doing here, right? I have said these words before. This is not the first time I've been going through them, but also making sure that you have something for people to look at, to process through, and they understand the organizational side of where you're going with it. All right. Well, I hope that was useful for everyone. Thank you all. We have time for a couple of questions, and we got some good ones popping up in the chat. Feel free to throw some more in there, and we will start deep diving them. Yeah. So here, don't forget to check us out on social media. We'll keep you up to date on all the fun stuff of the world. We do a lot of different services, SAT, ACT. We do AP prep. We do high school help, college help, middle school help. We also work with study skills and executive functioning processing. So we have a fun executive functioning quiz that you can check out, and we'll throw that in the chat as well. So you can just click on that link there. That if you complete it, it will help you understand where you're at in that process currently, or where your students at in that process, but also set you up with fun, short weekly video tips that'll go directly to your inbox of different ways to be thinking about things. All right, Jed, let's dive into these questions.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, John and I have been recording these little like 3-minute snippets. I did a 3-minute piece on anxiety yesterday, like, the body techniques, and, I did one on scheduling, so we're kind of doing these little one hitters, and they're fun, and parents seem to like them. We also want to tee up just a little survey here. It's a couple questions. Actually, I think it's one question. If we were to provide any service that would be beneficial or helpful, do you have any needs we can help with? And if you click anything, that'll just inform us if we should send you more information, that kind of thing. So go ahead and there we go. Just tiny. You can, if not, we can close it out. But if there is anything that we can help you with, let us know. Part of how we work. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and look at our Q&A. Here we go. First one out of the gate. These learning memory modalities you are outlining, are they specific for teens, or the same for teens and adults? Same for adults too. It's just how the brain works. And so ultimately, the teen brain and the adult brain aren't that different. I've taken classes on learning through the lifespan and how it changes, and there are different speeds, and processing speed does change. Adults end up having more crystallized, like long-term memory. So we have this, broader things to pull from, but the horsepower of a teen brain, it's just to be admired. We make more mistakes, but the trade-off is we lose some speed and we forget certain things, but ultimately we have a higher level of wisdom we can pull from more context. So I wouldn't trade my brain for my 18-year-old brain. They all have their places. That was a lovely brain. I could hold a lot. My working memory was pretty crazy, but my brain at 45, 46, I would take this brain with all the acquired knowledge and maybe wisdom over the years. So, all right, but yeah, otherwise these techniques, they work for kids, for adults, for people, for our grandparents. I'll do the same thing trying to teach someone who is 75 as I would someone who is 15. All right. Also, in terms of different ways of learning, is there a difference between humanities versus STEM subjects? And that block learning could work for humanities, but does not work. This research has been applied to different subjects, like Rodiger, Karpik. These guys were doing on. I've seen it with history. I've seen it in biology. I've seen other domains. I've seen it in narrative structures. I've seen it in math things. So yeah, I've seen it both for STEM and humanities, and the findings hold. It's just, I think, a function of how neurons work. I think we're down to the level of biochemistry and the physics of it all, in terms of like the reinforcement of how synapses work. It's kind of, the brain evolved a certain way of holding information, and this multiple rounds of reinforcement, and it's learned over millennia that things that happen a lot, and this is more important, make sure you don't forget this. So I think it's just a function of our learning, our thinking. Okay. Delete.
The
John.
next one's a good one. I actually was recording our video on that today. So if you subscribe to these short videos in your inbox, you'll hear my answer for that. But the quick answer of that, the question is, what's the best way to break bad study habits? And the answer to that question is, oftentimes a bad study habit is related to where you're doing the studying and the process that you've built around that, right? So like if you're trying to break a bad habit in any capacity, changing the place and the way you interact with it helps out a whole lot. So like often I have a lot of students who their bad study habit is they study in their bed. When they study in their bed, it's easy to be distracted. They're tired a lot more, and they struggle with the paying attention in that capacity. And so moving where they study and having a location that's devoted directly for that process, your brain becomes accustomed to when you sit down at your desk, you're going to be doing these processes. And so when you sit down, your brain's ready for them, and you're ready to try something new. So breaking a bad study habit, try it in a different place. It's going to take probably about 2 or 3 weeks to get used to it as well. So don't get frustrated that it doesn't magically change quick. But the process of doing it again and again with a new intention in a new location can really help.
Awesome. Next up, is it true that thinking with a positive mindset might improve end results? And I would say absolutely. If you want to do a deep dive, there is a very important researcher, Martin Seligman. Marty used to be the head of the APA, the American Psychological, and he was one of the key elements in positive psychology. He began studying learned helplessness, but then he shifted towards optimism and learned optimism and the ability to pivot. And a lot of his research was very clear that optimists have an advantage. That believing things are going to be okay, the better change is possible, they tend to do better academically, better in marriage, better in life. And you can learn how to do this. You can learn optimistic. And that's part of it, learning how to shift your thinking away from things being permanent, things being pervasive, things being personal, versus looking at when things go wrong. It's not permanent, but in this context, this happened because of these things. And not just, oh, I stink at this, I'm bad at this. I'm like this permanent, bam, I'm not good at math. I'm not good at taking tests. I can't act, I can't draw. And so it's, the positive mindset, there's ample evidence. And Marty Seligman, his protege was Angela Duckworth, who you may have heard one of her talks or podcasts on grit and all this good stuff. So positive thinking, it works. And again, if you're not sure about this one, read Ethan Kross's book, Chatter. Again, I've seen this. My mom's a sample for me, but like she's changed after reading this one book, because her self-talk has changed and her behaviors have changed. And so again, it's like cognitive behavioral connection. If you change one, you change the other.
Yeah. The last one's a good question. I think that there's a tricky answer to this one, is that I honestly can't think of a scenario where a parent and a 17-year-old have a perfect relationship. And so sometimes hearing it from the parent isn't the right place to hear it from. So what I'm going to suggest you do, since this is recorded and you're going to get an email about it in a couple of days, is just play this for your student. Hey, student, here's my recommendation for you, is that passive studying is, pretty cool, but you're probably spending a lot more time studying than you would if you were doing active studying, which is rephrasing things, writing it down, putting in your own words, quizzing yourself, quizzing other people, practicing out loud in those capacities. Just staring at the text again and again and again you probably recognize isn't really working for you. So try something different a little bit, make it active, and you're going to study less time. And that's probably a boon for you. So there's my little blurb for you.
Awesome.
I think that might help.
Our final question for the night, then we'll call it. Someone asked again the name of that little book I mentioned. It's Ethan Kross, Kross, out of Michigan. And his book is called Chatter, Chatter. Amazon, $20. And again, there's no guarantee it's going to change your life, but it's going to give you strategies, and hopefully you'll find several that are going to be helpful to you.
I think it's important to say Jed is not being paid to promote this book.
I heard a podcast recently with him, and then I went and bought his book, and I've been reading his research, but I'm like, oh, I like this guy. He has a very nice view. And there's a whole, Michigan, they're doing plenty of good research on human improvement. And I like what they're doing now. And in Penn also, there are certain centers, out at Stanford, where they're like centers for this kind of research. And Ethan's someone who, he seems very accessible and down to earth. And he says, here are 20 plus modalities. Try one. Try to see what works. Because I've learned also, clinically, therapeutically, working with kids, everyone's different, how we're built. And so it's nice having having 20 things, and 3 of them will work with these kids versus I only have 1 trick. And so I like the process, like, here's 20 different things you can try, see what works. All right. So this was fun, as always, John. It was good. And if you guys need help in any way, we're here, we're around. We work with students. We have for 20 years. We've 40,000 students we've worked with, which is a lot.
Wow.
That's pretty cool over the years. So everyone have a great night, and look forward to the next round.
Yeah, thank you all.